All right, we are continuing our study of leadership, and this is our third lesson dealing with visions, plans, and answers, and you'll see what that is all about here in just a second. Our goal for our study is to do two or three things. One is to develop future leaders, both in the immediate future and in the near future, that is, and those who are near readiness, and develop young men who are a distance from that yet, maybe a number of years, to help them to start looking toward those qualities of leadership. And so we'll be talking about that throughout the series. And also prepare wives whose husbands may be in leadership position. And you say, well, what about all the rest of us? Well, for us all then to understand the role of leadership, understanding how decisions are made, sometimes working through scenarios as we are in our assignments, will help us to be more cooperative, perhaps, and helpful at times, even with suggestions of how to deal with that. We'll come to all of that a little bit later. So one of the things that and I'll remind you this each time, though briefly, that one of our goals is at the end of this series is to ask you to submit names, not to be appointed at this point, but who you think may be potential in the 1 to 3 year range and the 3 to 5 year range. Those numbers, again, may vary a little bit. And tell us what they need to work on, and then the elders will sit down without giving your name to them, that here's some things that the congregation thinks you need to work on, and you could be a potential leader, elder in the future. So we're looking toward that, toward the end of this, or toward the first of the year. We're ready for our third lesson. The lessons 3, 4, and 5 are all dealing with this concept of visions, plans, and answers. And the point of that simply is that a leader must have some vision of where he is going to lead the group, if he's going to be a leader, where he's going to lead them, what he's going to lead them to become, what changes are going to take place, and plans of how to get there, and answers to some of the obstacles. We'll see that as we go along. Nixon once said, some people live in the present, oblivious to the past and blind to the future. Some dwell in the past, and very few have a knack of applying the past to the present in ways to show them the future. Great leaders have this knack. I think he was right about that. Whether you liked him or disliked him, that's regardless of that, the point's still true. And that is that great leaders, whether you're talking in the political realm, you're talking about on the ball field, or you're talking about in the corporate world, or you're talking about in the church, leaders who are effective leaders know something of the past and use that to guide them toward the future, and they have some kind of vision and plan. Would you agree with this, that a leader is out front in his actions, but even further out front in his thinking? Would you agree with that? Why does he need to be out front in his thinking? All right. Needs to anticipate problems and to address them. What else? All right.
Be proactive. That way you see the problem before. It's easier to solve a problem that might occur rather than trying to deal with a problem that's already occurred.
All right. Very good. Mike?
If he isn't out front, he can't be a leader, he'll be a follower.
Absolutely. Yeah, if he doesn't lead, then he's going to be led. And so he needs to be out front in his thinking. A leader must have visions for the future. We'll define visions in a moment, and plans of how to get there, and answers for obstacles along the way. And so again, it may be the coach on the ball team, it may be a little league team, or it may be an NFL team, or it might be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. A leader is a person that must have visions of where we're going to be in the future. Well, how are we going to get there? Well, he's got to have some plans for that. And then, well, here's some obstacles. He's got to have some answers for those as well. Now, the lesson we're going to be talking about is application of these principles. So let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's talk about elders and their role of leadership. And there'll be some lessons later on about the authority and the rule of elders. We'll talk about that. In fact, I'm going to be gone 1 week, and I think Larry will be teaching that class on the rule and authority of elders. It's part of what he'll be dealing with. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Someone read that for me. Who has that? Go ahead.
So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly.
All right, what do we see in this text that suggests elders obviously are leaders? Who was that? Who? What did you say, Mark?
I said they're responsible for oversight.
All right. They have the oversight. They are overseers, which means they are leaders, and they must have, if you're overseeing and leading the flock, there must be visions, there must be plans. We'll talk about the lack of that here in just a moment. Now, Acts 15 is not talking about elders as such, but we read about leading men. So it pleased the apostles and elders and the whole church to send men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, and also who was also named Barnabas, and Silas, leading men. These were not elders in the church, but they were called leading men in the church. What's interesting is that word leading. This simply means it can be one that leads or to consider, but it also means to go before or to go ahead. So these are leading men. These are men who are out front. That's the point I'm talking about, is if they're out front, they're leaders and they have visions and plans. So we're going to look at three things. One tonight, the second, plans next week, and then answers the third week. And so tonight we're going to talk about visions. Now, when we talk about visions, let's define what we're talking about. Vision, disregard that. That's supposed to come in a little bit later. I'm not talking about vision in the sense of prophecy, that a man has a vision that's come from God, as the prophets may have a vision from God, a revelation from God. But when we're talking about a leader having vision, we're talking about a leader having the ability to perceive something that's not visible. Does that make sense? And so here's this company that's going down the tanks, and they get a new CEO, and he has a vision of pulling it out of the red and making it a successful company, and maybe eliminating some people, eliminating some of their products, and focus on developing a different product. See, he's got a vision for the future. Whether it works or not, that's his vision. And so how's he going to get there? Well, that's a plan. We'll get to that later. But he's got to have a vision for that. Does it make sense? Same thing with vision in the church. We're talking about the concept. Here's a person that can see a showplace in a rundown house. Now, that's not spiritual, but it illustrates the idea of a vision. Here's someone that looks at a house. It looks like it's about to fall in, and what they can see is the potential. Others just see it just a rundown house. I wouldn't have that. I would never live there. But one can see that as potential. I can make this a show place. I can remodel that. Or there could be someone who goes to a junk pile and they see a beautiful piece of furniture. Doesn't look like it to me. But they can see what it can become. Here's the potential that's there. So what is the potential of this church? What can it become? Someone said, I see a church riddled with problems. Is there potential though? Is there something that can come out of this? Can we make it better? That's a vision. Making sense? All right. It has to do with foresight. It has to do with having a dream. The idea of having a mental image produced by imagination that I can picture and I can imagine this is what the future will be, and then we need to talk about a plan to get there. Now, we're right in the heat of a political season. Can you imagine a political candidate that you ask about the future and they have no vision of what's ahead? I'm not saying they can predict the future, but what do you see this country being in 5 years? A safer country, a better border, better economy, or do you see open borders? Do you see an economy that's tanking? What do you see in the future? And if he said, well, I really don't have a clue. I don't have a clue about the future or how to get there. What do you think about that kind of leader? Not much of a leader, is he? But I want to tell you, spiritual leaders sometimes are not better when they're asked about the potential of what the future of the church looks like. What do you see this church in 5 years, 10 years? And if he has no clue, well, I don't know. I'm not asking you to predict the future, but what's your vision of this church in the future? Does that make sense? There's a big difference in that. What's your vision for this church? Particularly, here's a man that we're thinking of appointing as an elder. Might be good to ask him, what's your vision for this church? What changes would you like to see made in this church? Where would you like to lead? What do you want to see accomplished? Where do you see this church in 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years, and 50 years? What do you see? And how can you contribute to that? Make sense? Plans and visions. We're talking about visions. Now let's talk about leaders in the Bible that had vision. Last week, this one ought to be quite simple because we dealt with Nehemiah last week. What vision did Nehemiah have in chapter 2 and in 17? Yeah, he told the people. Remember, he surveyed the circumstance and then he came and he said, let us rise and build. But I want you to notice something in Nehemiah 2:17, and I want us to focus on the vision. He didn't just say, well, let's give it a try. He didn't just say, let's take a shot at it. I doubt it's going to work. I doubt it's going to get anywhere. We may not get very much built, but let's give it a shot. That's not what he said. Notice at verse 17. You see the distress that we're in. Jerusalem lies waste. The gates are burned with fire. Okay, Nehemiah, I got the problem. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem. He sees a wall. He sees a vision of a wall. How much of the wall does he see completed? He sees a vision where we're no longer a reproach. He sees the vision of a wall that's complete. Does that make sense? Looks like a bunch of ruins to me. But Nehemiah sees a wall standing up in the midst of that ruins. Let us rise up and build. Here are people that have been there a while and it hadn't been rebuilt yet. They didn't see that. In fact, when the report came to him, remember chapter 1? There was nothing about there. We see a wall coming up. Nehemiah saw a wall. That's a vision of a leader. Make sense? Let's talk about another leader or two together. Joshua and Caleb. What did they see? We call them, these were spies. We call them spies. They were sent, and they said, we're able to overcome. Remember, most of the spies said, oh man, no way to do that. But here are two said, we're able to overcome. They are but grasshoppers in our sight. We can do it. They had a vision of a conquest. I don't mean they had a revelation of that. This is their own thinking. We think and we feel like that we're able to do that. You sent us in to assess, that's our assessment. Did they make good leaders? Oh yeah, they made great leaders. Joshua and Caleb did. In fact, they were the only two of the original number that made it into the land. Jesus had a vision of the gospel spreading throughout the world. And you say, well, he was divine. I got that. But it still is an illustration of a leader leading his people and has a vision. What did Acts 1 and verse 8 say about the spread of the gospel? Not only vision, but it's a plan. The gospel will begin at Jerusalem, then into Judea and Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. Sound like a plan to me, doesn't it, you? We're going to start here, spread it out there, and then go even further. And so he saw a vision of the gospel going to the whole world. It hadn't yet, but it's about to. He saw a vision of that. All right, here's one more that we want to mention. Luke chapter 14. Now, this is not a case in point, but it's of a specific leader. But it talks about counting the cost of discipleship. That's the point in the context. So we don't want to lose sight of the context. But there is something to be learned. What illustration does Jesus give here in Luke chapter 14 of counting the cost? Beginning at verse 28. If you're going to build a tower, what about building a tower? You know what it's going to cost. And if you're building a tower, knowing what it's going to cost, you have a vision of how big it's going to be, how much materials it's going to take. Just like you do if you're building a house. You don't have to have a drawing. You can have a vision in your mind. I know about how big a house I'm going to build, and I know about what it's going to cost because I know what it costs per square foot. You can have a vision of that before you ever build. There's another vision. What is it in verse 31? Yeah. And so he has a vision of victory. How many men will it take? I don't know. Let's just go try it. No, you get your army together so you plan. And so leaders have vision. All right? Vision involves the seeing the potential and the possibilities. Now, what's the potential? One author said that talent hits the target no one else can see. Genius hits the target no one else can hit. Genius hits the target no one else can see. There may be people who can accomplish things that no one else even can accomplish, but a great leader has a vision and sees things out there that maybe no one else sees, like the wall standing in the midst of the ruins. No one else seems to be seeing that wall. Does that make sense? A vision is when a person has the picture of what they would like to see in this church. So let's list some things. Spiritually, where does the leader want this church to be? In knowledge? What does he want them to know? How does he want them to mature? In what ways do they need to mature? How and in what areas do they need to grow? Does that make sense? So he needs to have visions. I want to see a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, the church has matured and improved in this area of spirituality. In this area of knowledge, we're going to work on. You say, well, that's the preacher always. No. There's much goes on in elders' meetings where the eldership is advising we need lessons on. We need studies on. And much of what comes out of the pulpit has come out of elders' meetings because that's elders' jobs of feeding the flock. Make sense? All right? Numerically, what is the potential for growth? How large could we be? We're not interested merely in numbers, but good leadership is planning numerically. Are we converting at a rate? Are we growing at a rate? Do we need to make plans? How large could we be 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Are we dwindling in size? Are we getting larger in size? Financially, what can we do? How can we do it? And how many men can we support? Rather than stuck with the status quo, where can we go? What can we accomplish? We also are able to see, if we have vision, we're able to see potential dangers and obstacles. How so? If you're appointing someone to be a leader and you say, I believe this man has vision, as we've defined it, that means he should be able to see potential dangers and obstacles. What do you mean by that? If you say, yeah, I think he can do that. What do you mean he can do that? Absolutely. Absolutely. He needs to be well aware of maybe things going on in the area. And we're living in a society where something going on the other side of the earth can heavily influence us right here. On the blogs, on Facebook, etc., online studies. So we need to be aware of what's going on. So what trends are being seen among brethren? What trends are we beginning to see among the local church? Maybe the question of how does history help us see the future? If a man doesn't know anything about the history of issues in the church, may not have any clue when he sees some danger creeping in. Does that make sense? So that's why knowing something of history is very important with a leader having vision. He can see, you know what? This happened time and again through history, and here it's about happening again, and I see it developing again, and we need to be ready for that. Who's influencing our people? A good leader keeps his ears tuned to the ground of who people are listening to. When people are saying, you know, I heard so-and-so preach, and you recognize that name is not synonymous with soundness, just pay attention. Good leaders will pay attention to that. Someone says, and you see people sharing a blog or sharing a post, and or liking a post, and it's not something that is as sound as you think it ought to be, you might pay close attention as a leader. That has potential for influencing this church. Being regurgitated in Bible classes or maybe in private studies. Watch for potential dangers and obstacles. Now let's talk about some goals that leaders in the church should have. You say, well, okay, I want to be a leader and I have goals. I'd like to see, and maybe it's something that you're thinking of, I'd like to see this church grow and maybe build a new building and have just completely revamp a bunch of stuff. Let's go back to the basics. To be a great leader in the church, one of the first and major goals is to keep the church sound in the faith. Would you agree with that? So picture yourself, you're not an elder now, and you are soon appointed as an elder, and you don't do this by yourself, I don't mean that, but in your function as an elder for the next 10 years, and then for whatever reason you need to resign or you move off, but for that 10 years, you did everything you could, and everyone else will contribute it partly to you, that this church is sound in the faith during that 10-year period. Have you been a success as a leader? That's a huge deal. Let's go to Titus 1. Titus 1. Why do I cite Titus 1, not a specific verse? Start back at verse 13, we work our way backwards. Rebuke them sharply that they may be sound in the faith. That's the theme and the thought of the book of Titus, being sound in the faith. The term sound is used throughout chapter 2. So chapter 1, if we're looking at chapter 1, someone would say, oh, that deals with the qualifications of elders, and you're right about that. That's not a disagreement. But I don't think his point in the book of Titus is, oh, by the way, let's throw in some things here about the qualifications of elders. The point in Titus is that these men who meet these qualifications are appointed to guard and protect your sound faith. That's the point of Titus 1. Does that make sense? And so whatever they're teaching, whatever rebukes they give, whatever guidance they give, that should be the ultimate goal. So a goal and a vision should be that I see this church a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, continuing to be sound in the faith. And if it's not now sound in the faith, I want to guide it to being sound in the faith. Now, he can't do it by himself, but together with other elders, he can do that. You agree with that? All right, let's talk about another goal he should have. To spread the gospel and convert the lost. Would you agree with that? What's your vision for this church? And what if the man that you're thinking, I'm going to put his name forward, says, my goal is to see that this church spreads the gospel as effectively as it can in this community and beyond. Is that a good goal? Is that a good vision? Maybe, maybe not. All right. 1 Timothy 3:15, the church is the pillar and ground of truth. Thank you very much. Maybe the goal should be to support men to preach the gospel. And so you say, what's your goal as a leader? I want to see that this church is leading men to support men in preaching the gospel. This is a very important goal, preventing apostasy of any individual and the church as a whole. Now, 2 Peter 3, verses 16 to 18, what does that have to do? We've talked about it multiple times. You may have marginal notes. I'll start you off. There's three things. Verse 16 is one, 17 is another, verse 18 is the third. Verse 16, I'll start you off. Some people pervert the scriptures. Therefore, verse 17, number 2, some could be carried away, led away. Very good. Therefore, the answer to that, verse 18, grow in the grace and the knowledge. When people pervert the scriptures, they take it out of context. That leads people to apostasy, verse 17. So verse 18 saying you need to study and know the text in its context. So part of preventing apostasy is make sure the text is taught in its context. You say, well, I'm not going to be the preacher. You're one of the leaders. You're one of the elders. You're responsible. It's on your shoulders to see that that gets done. Preacher or no preacher, that's your job. Rest on your shoulders. You're an elder. Make sense? So we're trying to prevent apostasy both as the church as a whole, but there may be an individual you need to work with trying to prevent them as you see them depart. And to edify and to strengthen the church, Ephesians 4:16. Now here's something that leaders need to be aware of. They need to be aware that the unknown can happen. What does that mean? You can't know everything that's going to happen. Very good, Mark. Plan as much as you can. You can have visions of the future. What you can't see is what's going to hit you around the corner. Every elder that I've ever known will tell you they have faced obstacles. Did you ever face obstacles you didn't know you was going to face, Mike? Mike Turner's visiting with us from Indiana. He served for a number of years as an elder. Larry, did you ever face something you didn't? George? Yeah. There's always that unknown. Now, though criticized for this, I love this quotation from Rummy. He said, there are known knowns, that is things we know, and there are known unknowns, things we know we don't know, but there's also unknown unknowns, things we don't know we don't know. He was laughed at about that, but that is a true statement. He was talking about war. That there are things I know we don't know about this war. He was leading in the war as Secretary of Defense. But there's also things we don't know that we don't know. And as a leader, there's going to be things you don't know that you don't know. And that unknown may catch you by surprise. And you can have visions of the future, but you don't have all visions of all that's going to happen. Olin Miller said to be absolutely certain about something, you must either know everything or know nothing about it. I think he's right about that. All right. Vision involves setting goals. So let's quickly some goals, and then I want to get to our scenarios here, if we can. In setting goals and having visions, we need to ask what goals do we presently have? We may have none, or we may already have goals that we're not meeting. So what goals do we have already? Secondly, don't set more goals than you can make. Some leaders suggest in the corporate world, set 3 or 4 major goals for this corporation. Well, we may have more than that in the church, but rather than have a list of, here's 100 goals I want to accomplish as a leader, narrow it down to 3 or 4 basic. This is what I want to accomplish. And don't set more goals than you can accomplish. Why? It gets discouraging when you can't meet those goals. Goals should be challenging but not impossible. In other words, if we're not challenging us, take a ball team, and you say, well, we last year we won about half the games. Let's see if we can win just a little over half. It's not very challenging. We're going to win them all this year. We're going to try to win them all. We can win them all. Set goals that are challenging but not impossible. Write those goals down as a reminder. Talk about the goals often. Set deadlines. What does 2 Corinthians 8 have to do with this? Rather than sometime we would like to, someday we will, what happens to someday? Never comes. What does 2 Corinthians 8 have to do with that? What did Paul tell the church at Corinth concerning their contribution? You were ready a year ago. Now, therefore, perform the doing of it. Get with it and do it. Set a deadline, set a goal, get it done. And we would like to improve the Bible class program someday. No, next year. Or we want to support more preachers. Okay, when? Well, let's see if we can't be supporting 5 by this date, or 6, or whatever the case may be. Set goals that are reasonable. Be willing to change and alter some of those goals. Now, I want to skip through that in interest of time. Goals need to have a purpose. When a leader has a vision of the future for the church, it needs to have a purpose. And a basic question to always ask is why? Would you agree with that? For example, some will have a vision of a change for the sake of change. I want to do things different. Nothing wrong with that, but a good question would be, why? Sometimes we want to make a change because it's a change, it's different, and then it's not long till somebody wants to change it back to the way it was before. So a good question to ask about the vision is why? I want to do thus and so. Okay, great, that's great, but why? You need to have a good reason for that. All right. Let's go to Proverbs 11:14. Just want to suggest some of your visions as a leader may be suggested or learned from others because you as a leader will not have all the ideas. The leader who thinks they have all the ideas and a man who says, I think I've got all the answers and all the ideas and I would like for y'all to appoint me as an elder, what's your response to that? It'd be very hard to work with. And arrogance would just be one of the reasons he's not qualified. He doesn't have all the answers. So what are these passages? In the multitude of counselors, there is wisdom. What does that tell you? Two heads are better than one. What'd you say? No one has all the ideas. You may learn something from somebody else. Somebody may have a great idea, but they don't have a plan. That's one reason we have 2 meetings a year with all the men. Some man may come up with an idea, and, well, how are we going to accomplish that? He just had a great idea. Now it's our job as elders, if that is a great idea, to see if we can implement that. And he may have had a great vision that we haven't seen, and we may want to implement that. I had someone in my house one time, not the one we're in now, but years and years ago, was in my house, and she knew nothing about carpentry, and she said, if I was you, I'd take this wall out. I said, you can't do that easily, because that's a weight-bearing wall, and she knew nothing about weight-bearing walls. And that can't be done easily. It can be done, but it's difficult. Well, I don't know about difficult, but that's what I do. Guess what? That's what I did. They didn't know how to do it, but they had a vision that I hadn't seen. So we took the wall out. Wasn't easy, but we took it out. Same thing with church. Some man may come up, or woman come up, or say some child, I wish the church would do X, Y, Z. And you think, okay, we can't do. Well, maybe we can. That was a great vision. It wasn't their job to have the plan. We're the leaders. We're supposed to have a plan to get there if that's a great idea. All right. Proverbs 15:22 goes along with that. I'm going to skip these quotes in the interest of time. Now, this one's quite interesting here. You can develop vision and improve. You may be sitting here tonight thinking, I don't think I've got visions of the future. And you may not be ready then for leadership right now, but you can develop that. Wow, would you agree with that? Well, would you disagree with that? Let's go the other way. Can you develop visions, plans for the future? Wouldn't that be part of growing spiritually? The more I grow spiritually, the more I'm going to see what this church needs. Particularly being sound in the faith. Maybe I didn't see the value of maybe teaching that shows the text in its context to prevent apostasy. But as I grew, I see the need for that. Now that's one of my visions for the future. And that may be part of developing the Christian graces. As I grow more patient, or as I grow more in knowledge, grow more in love, I see the church needs to develop more in this area. And now I have a vision of where I want this church to be in 10 years. Make sense? Interesting, Walt Disney was dismissed from a newspaper because he lacked, of all things, imagination. All right, let's go to our scenarios. This is the one we dealt with last time, and we were talking about it, and I think we're going to have time to deal with all the cases tonight. This is left over from last week. So if you have your paper from September the 11th, it's the first one on that, and we haven't started on the second one. I just wanted to make a brief comment about this one. We had many good suggestions on this scenario of how to deal with this. And our purpose, if you haven't been here for that, is in all these scenarios to learn a lesson about leadership, not just to settle this problem. Every one of these are real case scenarios that somebody somewhere has dealt with that I've known of. But be that as it may, I wanted just to list some things that we learn from this scenario. And so if you weren't here, you're not going to remember all the things that were said. But here's what we learned. One comment that was made was, this was preventable. If the elders had been doing their job, this was preventable. Because if this preacher is this poor in his presentation, the elder should never have hired him in the first place. So many problems are preventable. That's one lesson to learn. Try to prevent as many problems as you can, and then you don't have problems to deal with later. Secondly, another lesson to be learned is that sometimes claims don't match reality. In other words, the claim of those people leaving may not match the real reason they're leaving. Maybe it does. I don't know. Another suggestion was work on the problem. Try to remedy the problem before we make any drastic measures. And then the last one was we have to do what's best for the church, even if that means we dismiss the preacher. Because we have the interest of souls. If they're not being fed the gospel, or if they're not learning the gospel, if they're not learning and being edified, the best interest of the church has to be taken into play. Would you agree with that? Those are some lessons we learned. Now, we didn't get to this one, so here we go. Here's another scenario. You're an elder, and there is a young widow in the congregation. She's 25 years old. Her husband left a good insurance policy. The problem is that with no family and some time on her hands, she is a real busybody. She goes from one member's house to another talking about other people's business. How would you handle this, and what would you recommend as a solution? You're an elder, so don't come asking somebody else what are they going to do. The question is, what are you going to do? You're one of the elders.
If you verify those facts and that is the fact what's going on, I think that's a great opportunity for an elder's wife to get involved.
All right. I like the way Ricky started that. If you verify, that's one of the things we're learning. Just because someone makes a statement doesn't mean that's the exact facts. Don't mean anybody's lying. It just may be we don't have all the data here. So if it's verified, this is the situation, a good case for the elder's wife to get involved. And might I add that when we've done that kind of thing, we usually are informing our wives to be sure and tell the person you're coming on behalf of the elders. You're spokeswomen, I guess, for the elders. Is that a good idea? Our husbands, the elders, have sent us. What else would you do? Say again? Okay. And that's sometimes a judgment call. I think that's a good point. And that's one of the first things I had written down. Have a series of classes or sermons on the tongue. And in that series, then you might deal with gossip, and you might curtail some of that just by teaching on that in a general way. At other times, it may be best to talk to them individually. So that would be a possible solution, or at least part of a solution. Yes, ma'am, Linda.
It might be a good time for the elders to have their wives start a ladies' class. And not just single out that person initially maybe, and have some classes just for women. So we could talk more frankly and more specific about how women
Good point. Good point. We don't know all the details. That's right. Yes, ma'am.
Something else that could be done is, she's 25 years old, she may just not have experience in doing for others. So the ladies, when they talk to her, may come with ideas of, this sister needs help with this or that or the other, and can you do? Because a person who's busy doing has less time to be talking.
All right. Good point. When we go to her, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
The way that the elders were informed about it, if those people are receiving that information too, they should also be involved in stopping the meddling or discussion of whatever's going on in their house.
Good point. Good point. When the women go to her, or the elders, as the case may be, what would you say to her? There's a number one thing needs to start with. Yes, ma'am.
So you're concerned about her reputation, her how people think about her, and that you want to help her.
Okay. Yeah, you want to share the love that we're coming out of concern. We're concerned for your soul, da, 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 da. And if we're going to talk to her about gossip, we need to, all right, even before that, I want to come back to that. We need to cite some scriptures. Linda? All right, don't be a listening ear. What I'm driving at is establish the guilt. If we're going to rebuke her, establish evidence. Make sure our evidence is together before we go. So if this has become a common thing, we're told that she's going from house to house and it's been reported she's gossiping and gossiping. We need to have our evidence. Passages that talk about establishing every word by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses are biblical principles of establishing your evidence. Number one. and then cite scripture that that's wrong, and then urge, starts with an R, repentance. Yeah, she needs to repent, doesn't she? She's guilty of sin. Now, nobody's mentioned this. Would you give her any advice? Now, here's the point. When we're all done and the board is erased on this one, and I hope we can get to the next one. Here's the thing I want you to learn from this case. Give biblical answers, and we haven't heard this one yet. Why you say that? The scriptures say so. Thank you. 1 Timothy 5 says younger widows ought to marry and bear children. So would it be out of place for the elders to suggest that to cure this problem, by the way, that was in the context that they were busybodies going from house to house. This is the exact same scenario of 1 Timothy 5:13. And the biblical answer was, get married and have children. So would it be out of place for the elders to suggest what you need to do is get married and have children, have a family, and you won't have time for this gossip?
Are the elders going to bring names of prospective partners? Because that don't always work.
No, that doesn't always work, but that's a biblical answer, and we can't argue with that. All right. Anything else on that scenario?
Part of the vision the elders should have is when that first event happened when she became a widow, there should have been a foresight to even have elders, have one of the wives, go and talk to her about 1 Corinthians 5 and say, this is going to be one of the temptations that you're going to be facing. This is going to be the snare that you're going to be under. And so, these words advise you
Good
for
point.
the rest of your life. So I think that's how you prevent that.
That's a good point. That here's the potential. Elders should have the foresight and vision, as Larry just mentioned, not only on that case, but there may be some other cases where people have done something and you know the history of how people have dealt with that in the past. You can go and deal with that and try to, as Barney Fife said, nip it in the bud. And let's see if we can get a hold of that early before we get too far. Make sense? So here's what I'm wanting us to learn from that. There are biblical answers, and always look for the biblical answer. Not just what would I do, but there is a biblical answer to that. 1 Timothy 5 described that very case and said she ought to get married and bear children. And so whether she does that or not, I don't think that's a command, but at the same time, that was the biblical remedy for that. And whether she does that or not, the gossip needs to stop. And something needs to be said about that. Yes, ma'am.
On that idea, if she has a good insurance policy, she needs to understand that just because it's good now, doesn't mean it's gonna be available for the rest of her life. And you may be talking to her about that, and a job is not a bad idea as well, like someone mentioned, because, setting that insurance up right and having it right, in 5 years, it's gonna have to be a very good policy. And that's also biblical in how we deal with our money.
All right. The next scenario that we had is, no, we're not going to deal with tonight. We'll save that for next week. And so hang on to the paper for September 18 and the one for whatever next week is. We'll try to get both of those next time.